No, 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 no.
بعد انت لازم سياسة.
The film opens in the chaotic aftermath of Gaddafi's downfall. As his massive stockpiles of weapons fall into local hands, rival militias ignite brutal turf wars, turning Benghazi into a perilous battleground. Most foreign embassies quickly shut their doors, but a small U.S. diplomatic post and a nearby CIA facility remain operational, guarded by a specialized team known as the GRS. Enter Jack Silva, a GRS operative arriving in Benghazi. At the airport, he's met by Tyrone Roan Woods, the seasoned commander of the local GRS unit. The two share a brief, warm reunion before heading toward their base. On the way, they witness a sudden shooting. Before they can react, they find themselves surrounded by armed militants. Roan immediately radios for support, but CIA Chief Bob denies the request, citing strict orders that GRS personnel cannot leave their compound. Tensions rise as the militants demand the vehicles be opened. Roan, however, confidently threatens them with imminent drone strikes should they attempt any violence. Convinced, the attackers back down, letting them continue. Upon reaching the CIA compound, Roan wastes no time confronting Chief Bob about the lack of support. The chief remains firm, emphasizing that he won't allow GRS actions to spark international conflict. Their team is hired security, not official CIA operatives. After this tense exchange, Jack is introduced to his new teammates, Geist, Tonto, Tig, and Boone, the man who quickly becomes his brother-in-arms. He surveys the compound, absorbing the critical instruction to always stay armed. Alone in his quarters, Jack reflects on Becky's apprehension about the mission, feeling the weight of her disapproval. Later, Jack meets with Chief Bob, who reiterates that it's the government's decision, not his, to deploy the GRS. He stresses his desire to avoid any misunderstandings with local forces and insists that the GRS steer clear of CIA operations. The next briefing has Roan outlining an upcoming meeting between CIA case officers Vayner and Giuliani, along with a Libyan oil executive whom Giuliani has been courting for months. Jack's role is to pose as Giuliani's husband, a scenario he finds deeply uncomfortable, given her abrasive nature. The team monitors the meeting closely. What begins smoothly soon turns tense when it becomes clear they're being observed. Roan intervenes to extract them safely. Jack quickly pulls Giuliani and Vayner back to their vehicle. Though initially frustrated, the CIA agent's irritation fades once they realize they are being tailed. A high-octane car chase ensues, ending with Roan skillfully forcing the pursuers to crash into a forklift before they make their escape. Later, Jack ends a call with Becky and their children, managing the guilt that tugs at him, before joining a virtual briefing with GRS Commander Glenn Doherty in Tripoli. Glenn informs them that U.S. Ambassador Christopher Stevens will arrive in Benghazi on Monday, accompanied by a small security detail. The GRS will be tasked with protecting the ambassador during his visit. The team proceeds to the special mission compound, encountering local militia members identified as 17 Feb. After carefully navigating past them, they meet DSS agents Scott Wickland and Dave Ubben, responsible for the compound's security. A sweep reveals the site is poorly defended and ill-equipped, a potential death trap if a major attack occurs. Roan reassures the DSS team that the GRS will be monitoring from a mile away at the CIA post, ready to respond at a moment's notice. On Monday, with translator Amal in tow, the GRS engages with tense local militants. Through calm gestures and diplomacy, they secure weapons from them, using the opportunity to trace the arms back to their supplier. Later, Ambassador Stevens joins the team, underscoring the importance of fostering peace in Libya to strengthen democracy. While the team listens attentively, Tonto dozes off, prompting Chief Bob to warn him that this is his final chance to maintain professionalism, or he'll be sent home. The GRS escorts Ambassador Stevens to a meeting with Benghazi's mayor, only to be dismayed by unauthorized journalists showing up to cover the event. Despite this, the meeting concludes without incident. Afterwards, the team warns the DSS agents that luck played a part in their safety. The DSS then introduces them to Sean Smith, a surveillance specialist responsible for securing the compound's communications. With the day's assignments complete, the GRS returns to base, ready for whatever comes next. The following day begins with a strange sense of routine inside the base, even as everyone quietly marks the 11th anniversary of the September 11 attacks. At the Special Mission Compound, Ambassador Stevens grows increasingly uneasy about security. He notices local Libyans watching the area from outside, studying the compound in a way that does not feel accidental. Meanwhile, the GRS operators take brief moments to connect with their families back home. During one of these calls, Jack receives unexpected news from Becky. She is pregnant. For a short while, that revelation becomes the only truly meaningful moment of the day. The afternoon passes calmly, almost deceptively so, with no obvious sign of what is about to happen. But as daylight fades, armed militants begin gathering near the compound. By nightfall, the quiet breaks completely. The attackers launch a sudden assault on the outpost, firing rifles and mortars as they storm the property. The ambassador and his DSS security detail are caught off guard as militants breach the building and begin shooting anyone in their path. In the chaos, Wickland manages to pull Ambassador Stevens and Sean Smith into a secure room. Back at the CIA annex, the GRS team sees the terrifying situation unfolding and immediately prepares to move in, but Chief Bob refuses to let them go. He insists that the local 17 Feb militia should respond first, arguing that the GRS has no authority there and should only be used as a final option. In Tripoli, Glenn Doherty is already aware that Benghazi is under attack. He quickly begins arranging transport, calling for a plane to get him there. At the same time, the militants close in on the safe room, creating an even more desperate situation. At the annex, Tonto pulls an Amal, knowing they will need him to communicate with the local fighters from 17 Feb. but Chief Bob still orders Roan to stand down. Elsewhere in the city, Geist moves fast to extract Giuliani from another meeting as the violence spreads through Benghazi. News of the attack begins reaching officials in the United States, while at the compound, the danger grows worse by the minute. The GRS team waits at the CIA base, frustrated and furious, still waiting for permission to move. During that delay, the militants set the compound on fire, with Stevens, Smith, and Wickland still trapped inside the safe room. After seeing the flames and hearing desperate calls for help, Chief Bob finally gives in. The GRS team races toward the outpost, but before they can reach it, they run into a militant roadblock. Amal tries to speak with the fighters, but before he can calm things down, another rival militia group arrives and a shootout erupts. Back at the CIA annex, Geist returns with Giuliani and tells Chief Bob to lock down the building before he heads back out toward the fight. Meanwhile, Roan and the others push toward the compound alongside members of 17 Feb. As they move through the area, they are stunned by how ordinary this level of violence seems to the locals. The team fights through several attackers before finally reaching the special mission compound. There, they find Wickland, who has escaped the burning building, but he does not have Stevens or Smith with him. This forces the GRS team to enter the smoke-filled structure and search for the missing men. Inside the burning building, conditions are nearly impossible. The smoke is thick, the heat is intense, and visibility is almost gone. They search as long as they can, but they only manage to find Sean Smith, who is already dead. Ambassador Stevens remains missing. Afterward, the GRS gathers the surviving DSS agents. Amal warns them that the militants are preparing to regroup for another assault. With little time, the team collects whatever equipment they can and gets ready to leave the compound. Before they can escape, another wave of attackers comes in. The GRS fights them off long enough to load the remaining DSS agents into a vehicle. Jack tries to give Wickland clear instructions, telling him to turn left once they reach the road so they can return to the CIA base. But Wickland is shaken and barely able to process what he is being told. He drives off ahead of them, but instead of turning left, he turns right, straight into hostile territory. The vehicle rolls directly toward the militants. When the attackers try to take them, the DSS agents refuse to be captured. They turn around and attempt to escape under heavy gunfire. Their only advantage is the armored vehicle, which absorbs the bullets as they race through the ambush. Somehow, they make it back to the CIA annex shortly before the GRS arrives. Once everyone is back inside, Chief Bob immediately argues that they should make a run for the airport, especially now that the ambassador is missing. Roan shuts that idea down, telling him it is far too dangerous. Roan demands that Chief Bob send out a request for help, but the chief insists that support is too far away and that evacuation is their only option. Roan finally pushes past him and makes it clear that he is taking control of the situation. With no real choice left, the shaken chief briefs his CIA team on the evacuation plan. Meanwhile, Glenn lands in Benghazi and begins making his way toward the annex. Back at the base, the CIA staff rushes to destroy sensitive documents and prepare to leave, while the GRS operators get ready for another attack. They know the militants have likely figured out where they are. After some time, a local contact warns them to switch off their lights, explaining that the glow will give away their position to anyone watching outside. Not long after, the team realizes the compound is being surrounded. Armed men are slowly moving closer from multiple directions. The GRS braces for impact. Once the attackers get close enough, they hurl grenades into the compound, triggering another violent firefight. The operators return fire from defensive positions, holding the line as the militants press forward. After a fierce exchange, they manage to drive the attackers back without losing anyone, giving them a small but badly needed victory. Later that night, Glenn finally reaches Benghazi, but his progress is delayed by local generals arguing over who will be paid to transport his team to the CIA base. While he is stuck negotiating, the men at the annex continue standing guard. The GRS and DSS teams defend the compound against further threats, while inside, the CIA personnel keep making urgent calls for help, hoping someone will answer before the next attack begins. Roan listens to him, understands where he is coming from, and allows him to stay with the team. Later, Amal and Giuliani continue negotiating with the local generals, trying to convince them to guide Glenn and his team to the CIA annex. Roan soon learns that Glenn has already reached Benghazi, but he and his men cannot navigate their way to the base because they do not know the area. Roan tries reaching out to local authorities for help, but they refuse to cooperate and only waste more time. Back at the airport, Glenn loses patience with the endless bargaining. He warns the generals in no uncertain terms that if anyone at the annex dies because of their delays, he will hold them personally responsible. Meanwhile, at the CIA base, Chief receives word that Ambassador Stevens may have been taken to a local hospital. Around the same time, Giuliani climbs up to the roof where Geist is keeping watch and brings him some food. Geist asks whether she has managed to get real help from the United States. Giuliani admits that it does not look likely. Geist tells her he does not know what will happen next, but she should still contact her people and keep trying. Elsewhere in the compound, Tonto urges Amal to leave while he still can and get himself somewhere safe, but Amal refuses. In his mind, he is already part of this fight, and he is not walking away. Jack then points out that if Stevens is somehow still alive, Glenn may try to reach him before coming to them. Before they can think too much about that possibility, the team spots another group of militants moving toward the annex. Minutes later, the next assault begins. The attackers open fire, and the GRS returns it from their defensive positions. The gunfight continues for a while before suddenly dying down again. Once more, the men are left in that unbearable silence, waiting for the next wave to come. During the pause, Jack begins to open up. He admits that he is scared of what his family will feel if he dies here, in a conflict he barely understands. He wonders why he keeps leaving home, why he does not simply stay with his wife and children. The thought of another man raising his kids if he never returns clearly haunts him. Roan understands that fear completely. He tells Jack that he worries about the same thing with his own son. For a brief moment, beneath all the gunfire and chaos, the two men are just fathers thinking about the families waiting for them back home. Their conversation is cut short when they receive news that Glenn and his convoy are finally on their way. Soon after, they also learn the devastating truth. Ambassador Stevens has been confirmed dead at the hospital. With that news hanging over them, the men prepare for whatever comes next. Everyone understands that the next attack may be the one they do not survive. Sometime later, Glenn finally reaches the annex with his men and a group of Libyan soldiers. His arrival lifts everyone's spirits, giving the exhausted defenders a badly needed sense of hope. But there is still a major problem. They do not have enough vehicles to evacuate everyone at once. Glenn tells the others to keep holding the base while more transport is arranged. But almost as soon as he leaves again, the compound comes under a brutal mortar and artillery assault. One mortar round lands nearby and badly wounds Geist. As Roan rushes to help him, another round strikes, killing Roan. Geist's arm is left severely damaged, and Ubben is also hit, suffering a serious leg injury. As Tig kneels beside Roan's body and prays over him, Jack stands nearby, devastated by the loss of his friend. Inside the base, Geist is rushed in for emergency medical treatment. Moments later, Ubben is brought in as well, his broken leg leaving him in extreme pain. The men are still trying to recover from the sudden destruction when they notice another large group of Libyans approaching the compound. Believing this may be the final assault, the defenders prepare for one last stand. Tonto, exhausted but defiant, makes it clear that if this is the end, he plans to go down fighting. Then he notices something. The approaching Libyans display the jambo, the friendly gesture they recognize. These are not enemies, they are allies. The realization overwhelms Tonto, and he breaks down with relief. After hours of violence, fear, confusion, and loss, help has finally arrived. Soon after, the GRS team, the DSS survivors, and the CIA staff begin evacuating the compound. Chief, emotionally shattered, seems ready to stay behind, but Jack snaps him out of it. He reminds him that if he stays, more men will eventually have to come back and rescue him all over again. Chief finally accepts this and leaves with the others. Tonto closes the gates behind them and asks Amal to come along, but Amal refuses. Instead, he apologizes for the shameful actions of his countrymen and chooses to remain behind. As the Americans pull away, the Libyans enter the compound and begin recovering their dead. In the final moments, the evacuees arrive at the airport and board rescue planes. Giuliani and Chief personally thank Jack and the rest of the GRS team for everything they did. Nearby, Tonto hands the keys to their vehicles over to the fighters from 17 Feb, and the local men happily drive away with them. The surviving GRS members reflect on the attack, suspecting that it was not random at all. To them, it feels like something that may have been planned long before that night. Still, through all the horror, they are grateful they had each other to rely on, and even more grateful that some of them are getting the chance to go home. Before leaving Libya, Jack calls Becky and tells her what happened. He reveals that they lost Roan, and then tells her this will be his final tour. Before the plane departs, he looks at his friend's body one last time, carrying the weight of that loss with him as they leave the country behind. The story closes by revealing that the incident brought international condemnation upon Libya. After this mission, most of the surviving men eventually stepped away from service, forever changed by the night they fought to survive in Benghazi. The movie drops us into Benghazi, Libya, in 2012, and right away, it does not feel like a normal battlefield movie where the sides are clearly marked and everyone knows what they're walking into. This is post-Gaddafi Libya. The old power structure has collapsed, weapons are everywhere, and Benghazi feels less like a city with rules and more like a place running on suspicion, fear, and whatever armed group happens to control the street that day. You get this constant feeling that nobody is fully in charge. Not the local militias, not the American officials, not even the men who are supposed to be handling security. And that's where the movie builds its foundation. At the center of the story is a small team of American security contractors working near a secret CIA annex. These are not fresh-faced soldiers learning how dangerous the world is. These are experienced military guys. They have been in rough places before. They know how to read a situation. They know when something feels off. John Krasinski plays Jack Silva, who arrives in Benghazi to join his friend Tyrone Woods, played by James Badge Dale. And the movie makes it clear pretty quickly. These men are walking into a place where the usual rules do not apply. Every road feels tense. Every checkpoint feels like it could turn ugly. Every local contact comes with a question mark over their head. That is one of the things the film does well early on. It gives Benghazi a nervous pulse. You are not just waiting for the big attack because the movie told you it is coming. You feel the instability before anything major happens. The danger is already sitting in the background. Then Ambassador Chris Stevens arrives at the American diplomatic compound, and that is where the setup becomes even more uneasy. The compound is not some heavily fortified fortress. It feels exposed, lightly defended, vulnerable in a way that makes the security contractors uncomfortable almost immediately. And because we are watching this through their eyes, we start to feel that discomfort too. The basic premise is simple, but it is effective. A small group of trained men are stationed in an unstable city, responsible for protecting American lives, while the situation around them keeps getting worse. They see the warning signs, they understand the risk, but the machinery above them moves slowly, cautiously, and sometimes arrogantly. So before the movie even becomes a full siege thriller, it is already working as a pressure cooker. You know something terrible is coming. The characters know something is wrong. The city itself feels like it could ignite at any second, and that is what makes the opening of 13 Hours work better than you might expect. It is not just about soldiers waiting for action. It is about being placed in a broken, dangerous environment where confusion is part of the threat. The movie's whole story grows out of that atmosphere. A secret CIA base, an underprotected diplomatic compound, a city full of weapons, and 6 men who realize far too early that if everything goes wrong, they may be the only ones ready to respond. Man, the first thing that hits you about 13 Hours is just how chaotic Libya feels. From the moment the team lands in Benghazi, it's not some neat, cinematic city with clear streets and obvious danger zones. No, this place is messy, unstable, and absolutely unpredictable. You get this constant tension in the air. Weapons are everywhere. Militias move through the streets like they own them, which, in a way, they do. Power is fractured, alliances are shifting by the hour, and nobody really knows who you can trust. One moment, a crowd is just walking past. The next, someone could be holding a rifle aimed at the wrong person. It's nerve-wracking because you start to feel that same paranoia the characters are living with, and it's not just the streets. The city itself feels alive in its own dangerous way. Buildings are battered, debris litters the roads, and there's a constant hum of tension, vehicles moving, people talking, someone watching from a rooftop. It makes the entire environment feel like a pressure cooker. Even the locals you see in passing, the civilians, carry this quiet fear. You can sense that life here isn't easy, that every day could erupt into violence. What the movie nails is that sense of unpredictability. You never feel safe. You never get the luxury of a clear line between friend and foe. And that's exactly what the filmmakers wanted you to feel. This isn't a controlled battlefield with neat objectives and checkpoints. It's messy, it's loud, it's dangerous, and it's alive. For the audience, that means every scene is charged. Every corner the contractors turn, every street they cross, you're thinking, something could happen here. And that tension carries through the entire movie, long before the attacks even start. The chaos of Libya isn't just set dressing. It's an active threat, a character in itself, and it gives the story this sense of urgency that never lets up. In short, 13 Hours makes you feel the city breathing down your neck. It's unstable, dangerous, and totally believable as a war-torn environment. And once the fighting starts, all that background tension explodes into full-on chaos. You're not just watching action, you're feeling what it's like to be stuck in a place where danger is everywhere, and nobody's really in control. When Ambassador Chris Stevens enters the story, the movie's tension shifts in a very specific way. Before that point, 13 Hours has already shown us Benghazi as unstable, armed, and unpredictable. The security team knows the place is dangerous. We know it too. But Stevens arriving at the diplomatic compound gives all that background tension a target. Suddenly, the danger is not just floating around the city anymore. It is sitting right outside a lightly defended American location. And honestly, that compound never feels safe. That is the whole point. The movie does not present it like some heavily fortified military base with layers of protection and backup plans. It feels exposed. A few walls, some guards, a structure that looks far too vulnerable for the kind of city around it. You can almost feel the contractors looking at it and thinking, this is not enough. That is where the uneasiness really starts to build. The GRS team sees the risk immediately. They are not being dramatic. They are not looking for a fight. They are simply reading the situation like men who have spent years surviving places where one bad assumption can get people killed. Benghazi is already tense, and now an American ambassador is staying in a compound that does not look prepared for serious trouble. The frustrating part is that their concern does not seem to carry enough weight. That is what makes this section of the movie work. It is not loud yet. It is not all explosions and gunfire. It is quieter than that, more uncomfortable. You are watching people notice danger before the people in charge are willing to fully admit it. And that kind of tension is sometimes more effective than action, because you are ahead of the disaster. You can see the weakness before it breaks. Stevens himself is not turned into some huge dramatic figure in the film. He is important because of what his presence represents. He is the person the compound is supposed to protect. He is the reason the stakes become sharper. Once he is there, every security flaw feels heavier. Every warning feels more urgent. And when the attack finally comes, the earlier concerns suddenly stop feeling like paranoia and start feeling like prophecy. The compound being underprotected becomes the trigger for the whole nightmare. The guards are overwhelmed. The safe room becomes a last resort. Smoke, fire, confusion, and panic take over what should have been a secure diplomatic space. That is the tragedy the film builds toward in this section. It is not just that an attack happens. It is that the movie spends time showing you how fragile the situation already was. The warning signs were there. The men on the ground could sense it. The compound looked vulnerable from the beginning. So when everything falls apart, it does not feel random. It feels like a disaster that had been waiting for one spark. Now let's talk about the guys at the center of the story. Jack Silva, Tyrone, Roan Woods, and the rest of the GRS team. These are the men who are really carrying the movie, and honestly, they are the reason you stay glued to the screen when the chaos hits. John Krasinski plays Jack Silva, a family man and former Navy SEAL who is sent to Benghazi to work at the secret CIA annex. Right away, you can see he's conflicted. He's skilled, confident in his abilities, but you also get the sense that part of him is constantly thinking about home, his wife, his kids, the life he left behind to do this dangerous job. Krasinski does a surprisingly solid job here. He's not the charming Jim Halpert we all know. He's more grounded, more serious, and it works. You buy him as someone who could make split-second life-or-death decisions. Then there's James Badge Dale as Tyrone Roan Woods. Roan is the anchor of the team, the guy who has seen enough trouble to know the stakes without anyone spelling it out. He exudes quiet authority, but also a kind of weary realism. You feel like he's the guy who's been through enough to know that sometimes doing the right thing doesn't come with a guarantee. Dale brings a physicality to the role, but also this understated emotional weight that keeps him believable, even when the movie is spinning into full-blown Bay chaos. The rest of the team, Tig, Boone, Oz, and Tonto, round out the group. Pablo Schreiber, Max Martini, David Denman, and Dominic Fumusa all deliver performances that feel competent and committed, but the script doesn't give them as much room to breathe. They're largely defined by their military skills, their role in the firefights, or a quick quip here or there. Krasinski and Dale are the anchors for audience empathy, but everyone else sometimes blurs together. By the time bullets are flying and explosions go off, it can be a little tricky to remember which face is which. That said, the movie does a good job showing them as a team. You can see the chemistry. They operate like a group of people who know each other well, who can anticipate each other's movements, and who trust one another even when everything around them is falling apart. It's that brotherhood under fire that gives the story its heartbeat. What I liked most about this team is that they're portrayed as humans first and soldiers second. They joke, they get frustrated, they bicker about minor things, and you occasionally see glimpses of the lives they left behind. The family moments and small interactions make them feel more real, even if the script leans a little heavy on those to make you care. But here's the catch. While the team feels real and the actors sell the danger convincingly, the movie doesn't dig too deep into individual personalities. You understand their skills, you respect their bravery, but beyond Silva's personal stakes and Roan's authority, most of the team remains a collection of capable, courageous figures rather than fully fleshed out people. And maybe that's okay. The film is more interested in showing how they operate in a high-stakes, chaotic environment than in giving us deep, intimate backstories. It's about how they move, react, and fight under pressure. Their professionalism, courage, and loyalty are what the movie wants you to focus on, and for the most part, it works. So yeah, the GRS team is the core of 13 Hours. They're human enough to make you care, skilled enough to make the action believable, and cohesive enough to carry the movie through some seriously intense and chaotic sequences. You might not leave remembering each name, but you'll remember their bravery, their instincts, and that sense of men doing everything they can to survive and protect others in a city that feels like it's on the brink of collapse. Here's where 13 Hours starts to show some cracks. Don't get me wrong, the action, the tension, the chaos, they're all gripping. But when it comes to really knowing the men you're supposed to be rooting for, that's where the movie struggles. The six-man GRS team is heroic, sure. They're skilled, disciplined, and clearly willing to put their lives on the line. You feel respect for them. You feel tension when they're under fire. But beyond Silva, and to a lesser extent, Roan, most of the team blurs together. By the middle of the film, I found myself double-checking which guy was which. Is that Tig on the roof, or is that Tonto moving to the gate? Who's shouting over comms right now? It's not that the actors aren't doing solid work, they're committed, believable, but the script doesn't do enough to make each of them distinct. A line of dialogue here, a joke there, maybe a tiny personality quirk, and that's about it. This matters because the movie spends a lot of time on prolonged firefights. When the camera is bouncing, bullets are flying, explosions are lighting up the compound, and men are moving from rooftop to rooftop, you need to be able to attach a face to the action. Otherwise, you risk feeling detached. You know something intense is happening, but the personal stakes aren't always clear. The family cutaways and small personal moments help, but they mainly focus on Silva. The others get almost no interior life. They are skilled warriors, yes, but emotionally, they're largely functional, types rather than fully rounded characters. Now, you might argue that this is realistic. In real life, soldiers in a chaotic situation don't sit around reflecting on their personalities. They act, they react, and they survive. And I get that, but for a film, especially one that wants the audience to care, that thin characterization sometimes dulls the emotional impact. You care that someone might die, but because you haven't really got to know them individually, the heartbreak is diluted. So in a nutshell, the GRS team works as a unit. Their courage, coordination, and brotherhood are clear. But when it comes to knowing each man as a distinct person, the movie leaves you wanting a little more. They're interchangeable in a way that is forgivable for pure action, but noticeable if you want emotional depth. Still, even with this issue, the film does enough to keep you invested. You feel the tension, you feel the danger, and you can imagine what it might have been like to be in their shoes. You just might wish you remembered who was who when the bullets start flying. One thing that really helps 13 Hours stay grounded is the cast. Because honestly, with a movie like this, the performances matter more than people might think. Yes, the action is loud. Yes, the firefights are intense. Yes, Michael Bay is clearly enjoying the scale of it all. But if the men at the center do not feel believable, the whole thing collapses into just another noisy war movie. And thankfully, the actors do a lot of heavy lifting here. John Krasinski is probably the biggest surprise, especially if you mostly knew him from The Office. Seeing him as Jack Silva could have gone wrong very easily. You could imagine the audience spending half the movie thinking, that's Jim with a rifle, but he does not play it like that. He strips away the charm, keeps the performance quiet, and brings this worn-down seriousness to the role. He is not trying to look cool every second. That helps. There is a heaviness to Silva. You feel that he is good at this job, but you also feel the cost of it. The family angle gives him something personal to carry, and even when the script gets a bit obvious with that material, Krasinski keeps it sincere. He makes Silva feel like a man who knows exactly what danger looks like, but still cannot fully stop himself from walking back into it. James Badge Dale, as Tyrone Roan Woods, might be even more naturally suited to this kind of film. He has that calm, controlled presence that works perfectly for a team leader. He does not need big speeches to convince you he is in charge. He just has that look of someone who has been through enough bad situations to know when things are about to go sideways. And together, Krasinski and Dale give the movie its strongest emotional center. Their friendship does not feel overexplained, which I actually appreciated. The movie does not stop everything to give us some long backstory about their bond. It is more in the way they talk, the way they look at each other, the way they trust each other when the situation turns ugly. That kind of chemistry feels lived in. The rest of the team also does solid work. Pablo Schreiber brings energy as Tonto. Max Martini has that steady, rugged presence. David Denman and Dominic Fumusa fit naturally into the group. Nobody feels out of place. They all look like they belong in this environment, and that matters a lot in a film built around military coordination and pressure. The team chemistry is probably stronger than the individual character writing. That sounds like a criticism, and it is, but it is also a compliment to the actors. Even when the script does not give everyone enough personal detail, the cast makes the group feel functional. You believe these men have worked in dangerous places. You believe they know how to communicate under stress. You believe they trust each other enough to move through chaos without needing everything explained. There is a rhythm to them. The banter, the frustration, the short commands, the little jokes before everything goes wrong, it creates a sense of brotherhood without turning the film into a full character drama. Sometimes the dialogue is clunky, sure. Sometimes the tough guy talk feels a little too movie-like, but the actors mostly sell it through body language and timing. And during the action scenes, that chemistry becomes even more important. When they are moving across rooftops, covering each other, calling out threats, or making split-second decisions, you feel the group operating as one unit. That gives the combat scenes more tension because it is not just random men firing weapons. It feels like a team trying to survive by trusting each other completely. Still, the performances can only do so much. The actors are good, but the script does not always reward them with enough depth. Krasinski and Dale get the clearest material. The others have moments, but not always enough to fully stand apart. So you may leave the movie respecting the team more than remembering each individual personality. But as an ensemble, they work, and that is a big reason 13 Hours has the emotional weight it does. The film may be messy, loud, and overlong, but the cast keeps it human. They bring sincerity to material that could have easily become hollow. They make the fear believable, the exhaustion believable, and the loyalty believable. For a war movie like this, that is not a small thing. Now this is where 13 Hours gets a little uneven for me, because when the movie is quiet, when it's building tension, when the men are scanning rooftops or trying to figure out whether a passing vehicle is friendly or hostile, it can be genuinely gripping. But then somebody opens their mouth, and sometimes the illusion cracks a bit. The dialogue is not always terrible, but it is very much war movie dialogue. You know the type: short lines, tough replies, men calling each other by nicknames. A bit of sarcasm, a bit of chest thumping, a few emotional lines that sound like they were written to be placed in a trailer. And look, some of that fits the world. These are military guys. They are not going to sit around speaking in polished, dramatic monologues. The banter is part of how they deal with stress. I get that. But there are moments where it starts to feel less like real men talking and more like a screenwriter trying to remind us, hey, these guys are rugged, loyal, funny, and fearless. The tough guy back and forth can be entertaining in small doses. But after a while it gets repetitive. Someone cracks a joke. Someone throws back a sarcastic comment. Someone says something about the danger they're in. Then the movie moves on. It gives the team personality, sure, but not always depth. And the comedy is a little tricky too. There are a few jokes that land naturally, because dark humor in a dangerous situation can feel believable. People under pressure do make jokes, soldiers especially. That kind of humor can be a survival tool, but 13 Hours does not always balance it smoothly. Sometimes the film is trying to be terrifying, almost horror-like, and then a joke slips in at the wrong moment and softens the tension in a way that does not really help. It is not that the movie should be completely humorless. That would feel fake too, but the tone occasionally wobbles. One minute you are locked into this brutal, chaotic situation, and the next minute the banter feels like it belongs in a more standard action movie. Then there are the family cutaways, and this is probably the most obvious emotional tool in the film. Jack Silva has a wife and kids. The movie wants us to feel that weight every time he picks up a rifle, every time he steps into danger, every time the situation gets worse. And to be fair, it works sometimes. John Krasinski sells that part of the character. He gives Silva this quiet sadness, like a man who knows he is missing pieces of his own life every time he takes another job like this. But the movie pushes it a bit hard. When you see the soldiers calling home, talking to loved ones, thinking about family just before everything goes bad, you can feel the film arranging the emotional furniture. It is saying care about them, remember they have families, remember what they might lose. And again, that is important. These men were human beings, not just action figures. Still, subtlety would have helped. The family material sometimes feels less like natural character development and more like a shortcut. Instead of giving every member of the team rich interior life, the movie leans on familiar images. The wife, the child, the phone call, the man torn between duty and home. Those things can be powerful, but when handled too directly, they start to feel mechanical. That is the frustrating thing about the writing in 13 Hours. The story itself already has emotion built into it. The danger is real. The stakes are clear. The situation is tragic. The movie does not need to underline everything 3 times. When it trusts the silence, it is stronger. When it lets the actors show exhaustion, fear, loyalty, and frustration without spelling it all out, the film feels much more human. But when it falls back on tough guy lines, obvious family reminders, or jokes that arrive at the wrong time, it starts to feel more manufactured. And that is a shame, because the cast is good enough to carry quieter material. Krasinski does not need a heavy-handed family beat every few minutes to make us understand Silva has something to lose. James Badgedale does not need big speeches to make Roan feel like a leader. The team does not need constant banter to prove they are close. Sometimes just watching them move, react, and trust each other under pressure says more than the dialogue ever does. So yeah, the script has its weak spots. The banter can be too familiar. The comedy does not always belong. The family cutaways are emotionally valid but often too obvious. And the dialogue, while functional, rarely rises above the level of a solid but conventional war thriller. But the movie survives it because the situation is strong and the actors commit to it. Even when the lines are clunky, the fear still feels real. Even when a joke misses, the danger comes rushing back. And even when the emotional moments feel a little forced, the tragedy underneath them is strong enough to keep the film from completely losing its grip. One of the most frustrating parts of 13 Hours is not just the attack itself. It is the waiting. That sounds strange because this is a Michael Bay war film. You expect gunfire, explosions, men running through smoke, all of that. And yes, the movie gives you plenty of it. But the thing that really gets under your skin is the feeling that these men are ready to move, ready to help, ready to do the job they were hired to do, and they keep running into hesitation from above. That is where the film builds a different kind of tension. The GRS team can see the danger. They are on the ground. They know the streets. They know Benghazi is unstable. They know the diplomatic compound is vulnerable. So when the attack begins, their instinct is immediate: go help. But the system around them does not move with that same urgency. The CIA station chief, Bob, becomes the face of that delay. He is not portrayed as some layered, complicated man making impossible decisions. The film presents him more directly than that. He is dismissive, controlling, arrogant, and always worried about what the contractors might expose or escalate. He keeps trying to hold them back when the situation clearly demands action. And honestly, it works on an emotional level because it makes you angry. You are watching people trapped in danger. You know time matters. You know every minute lost could mean someone does not make it out. So when the men are told to wait, or when support feels slow, distant, vague, or completely absent, the movie creates this awful pressure in your chest. It is not just, will they survive? It becomes, why is nobody helping them? That question hangs over the whole middle section of the film. The contractors are not asking for glory. They are not looking for a fight just because they want action. At least the movie does not present them that way. They are reacting to a crisis. They know Americans are under attack. They know the compound is burning. They know people are missing. And yet the response from the people above them feels trapped in caution, procedure, and self-protection. That is where 13 Hours becomes less about combat and more about institutional failure. The movie does not fully explain what is happening behind closed doors, and that is part of why it feels so maddening. We do not get a clean chain of command. We do not get a satisfying explanation for every delay. We do not see the full machinery of government working or not working. Instead, we mostly feel the absence of help from the perspective of the men who need it, and maybe that is why the frustration lands. Because from their angle, none of the politics matter in that moment. None of the careful language matters. None of the optics matter. There are people in danger, and the men closest to them are being slowed down. That is the emotional argument the movie makes. It is not subtle, but it is effective. Every unanswered call, every unclear instruction, every pause before action adds to the feeling that these men have been left to handle something much bigger than themselves. The night keeps getting worse, and the rescue they hope for feels farther away than it should. You start to feel their anger, their disbelief, and eventually their grim acceptance that they may be on their own. And this is where the film is strongest, not in explaining bureaucracy, but in making you feel the human cost of delay. Because delay in a normal office is annoying. Delay in a war zone is deadly. The movie understands that difference. It turns waiting into suspense, and then turns suspense into rage. By the time the team finally acts, you are not just relieved, you are frustrated that it took this long. That frustration becomes one of the engines of 13 Hours. It gives the action more urgency because the battle is not just against the attackers outside the walls. It is also against confusion, hesitation, slow communication, and the terrifying possibility that the people with power do not fully understand what is happening to the people under fire. And whether you agree with every choice the film makes or not, that feeling is hard to shake. The men on the ground are moving in seconds. The system above them seems to move in minutes. And in a night like Benghazi, that gap is everything. One thing 13 Hours captures better than people sometimes give it credit for is confusion. Not clean movie confusion, where the audience is a little lost for 5 minutes and then everything neatly clicks into place. I mean actual battlefield confusion, the kind where nobody has the full picture, every piece of information feels incomplete, and every decision has to be made before you fully understand what is happening. That is a big part of what makes the movie tense. Benghazi, as the film presents it, is not a place where the good guys and bad guys are standing on opposite sides of a bright line. It is messier than that. Someone might be friendly. Someone might be pretending to be friendly. A vehicle might be harmless. Or it might be full of armed men. A crowd might just be watching. Or it might become part of the attack. And the movie keeps putting the contractors inside that uncertainty. You feel them trying to read faces, roads, rooftops, headlights in the distance. Every little movement becomes suspicious. Every pause feels dangerous. They are not just fighting bullets. They are fighting bad information, delayed information, half information, and sometimes no information at all. That is where the title starts to feel heavy. 13 hours is a long time when you know what is happening. But 13 hours when nobody can clearly explain who is attacking, where help is, who is giving orders, and what the next wave is going to look like, that becomes something else entirely. It becomes psychological pressure. The film does not give the audience a clean map either. Sometimes that works, sometimes it is frustrating. There are moments where you are trying to figure out who is where, which building is being hit, where the attackers are coming from, and what the team's next move is. And part of me thinks, yeah, that is probably the point. The movie wants you in that fog. It wants you to feel the lack of control. But there is a thin line between showing chaos and becoming chaotic as a film. 13 Hours walks that line constantly. At its best, the confusion makes the action feel more real. The men are reacting in the dark, under pressure, with no perfect plan and no reliable certainty. That gives the firefights a nervous energy. You are not watching some clean tactical fantasy where everything is organized and heroic. You are watching people trying to survive a situation that keeps changing shape. At its weakest, though, the confusion starts to work against the movie. The geography can get muddy. The characters can blur together. The repeated attacks can feel like one long stretch of noise. And because the film does not fully explain the larger political situation either, you can leave with the same feeling many people had going in. Benghazi is still unresolved. That is maybe the strangest thing about the movie. It is based on a real event people argued about for years, but it does not really come to provide final answers. It does not unpack every decision. It does not clearly explain every delay. It does not tell you exactly who failed, how badly, and why. Instead, it mostly stays with the men on the ground and says, this is what the chaos felt like. And as a viewing experience, that is powerful. As an explanation, it is incomplete, but maybe that incompleteness is part of why the film lingers. There is no comfortable sense of closure, no neat final speech that makes the whole night understandable. Just smoke, fire, lost time, scattered commands, and men trying to make the least strong decision while everything around them falls apart. So when people say 13 hours is confusing, I kind of agree. But I do not think that is automatically a flaw. The confusion is the point, at least when the movie controls it. It is trying to show war as something messy, ugly, and almost impossible to fully process in the moment. You do not always know who is coming to help. You do not always know who is coming to kill you. And sometimes, even after the shooting stops, you still do not get the answers you were waiting for. Before you even hit play on 13 Hours, you're probably thinking about politics. And honestly, you can't blame anyone for that. This is a movie about the 2012 Benghazi attack, released just a few years after the event, in the middle of a heated political climate, with Hillary Clinton and the whole controversy still fresh in people's minds. Expectations were high that this could turn into a political statement or a full-on attack piece, and yet it mostly doesn't. The film does a strange kind of balancing act. On the one hand, it acknowledges the failures of bureaucracy, the station chief, the slow response, the people sitting behind desks making decisions or delaying action. That criticism is there, clear and sometimes frustratingly direct. You can feel the filmmakers pointing at the ineffectiveness and the hesitation, and it works to ratchet up tension. On the other hand, the movie never makes a direct political target out of anyone at the top. There's no explicit finger-pointing at Washington, no speeches about blame, no heavy-handed commentary on policy decisions. The attack is not framed as a scandal movie or a partisan reckoning. The focus stays on the men on the ground, on the GRS team, and on their desperate fight to survive and protect lives. It's almost like the film is saying, this isn't about politics. It's about chaos, courage, and the human cost. That approach has its strengths. It lets the story breathe as a human drama rather than a political essay. The audience gets tension, fear, and stakes without getting lectured about election years or political figures. You're following Silva, Woods, and the team, not a headline. But it's not perfect. Some viewers might feel a little cheated if they came expecting a clear-cut statement about responsibility or a deep dive into how policies failed. The film deliberately leaves those questions hanging. You can see it in the way the events unfold, delayed help, mixed orders, and bureaucratic caution, but there's no final judgment. No, here's who failed moment. In a way, that restraint works in the movie's favor. The story feels more immediate, more focused on survival than on commentary. It respects the audience enough to show the consequences of political inaction without spelling out every name, every failure, and every headline. So while you can go into 13 hours expecting politics, what you get is more subtle. The film acknowledges systemic issues, but it never turns them into a political soapbox. That restraint makes the movie feel surprisingly grounded for a Michael Bay film, and it keeps the focus where it should be, on the men, the danger, and the night that changed everything for them. Now, this is where 13 hours becomes a little more complicated, because on the surface, the movie is doing something very straightforward. It is telling the story of American contractors trying to survive a deadly night in Benghazi. It puts us with them, keeps us close to their fear, their frustration, their anger, and their loyalty to each other. And from that angle, the film works. You understand why the movie wants to honor them, but there is another side to it. The entire film is built almost completely around the American perspective. American lives are the emotional center. American fear is the tension. American courage is the payoff. American loss is where the grief lands hardest. And again, that makes sense for the story the movie is choosing to tell. But after a while, you do start to notice how narrow the frame is. Libya is mostly shown as danger. Streets, weapons, crowds, militants, confusion, smoke, shouting, gunfire. The country becomes this unstable backdrop where American men are placed in extreme danger. And while the film does show some fear among Libyan civilians, it does not really stop to explore that world in any deeper way. That is where the accusations of jingoism come in. The movie does not always wave the flag in the most obvious way. It is not full of speeches about American greatness. It does not turn into a political rally, but emotionally, it is still very much a brave Americans surrounded by hostile foreign chaos story. The contractors are framed as noble, disciplined, loyal, and courageous. The enemy, for most of the runtime, is just a wave of armed bodies in the dark. That kind of framing can be thrilling in an action movie. It can also be uncomfortable, because when the film keeps repeating this idea that you cannot tell the good guys from the bad guys, or that everyone is a potential threat until proven otherwise, it may reflect the paranoia of the men on the ground. But it can also feed into a much uglier, much simpler worldview, the kind where an entire region starts to look like one faceless danger zone, and that is not a small issue. Especially in a movie based on real events, the way people are framed matters. If the Americans are given names, families, jokes, emotional beats, memories, and heroic close-ups, while the Libyans are mostly reduced to attackers, crowds, or background fear, then the movie is quietly telling us whose lives matter most in its version of the story. That does not erase the bravery of the GRS team, not at all. The men at the center of the film are portrayed as courageous for a reason. They were facing a terrifying situation, and the movie is clearly built to recognize that. The problem is not that the film honors them. The problem is that it rarely widens its view beyond them. So the politics of 13 hours are strange. It avoids directly blaming specific leaders, but it still carries a very strong ideological shape. It distrusts bureaucracy. It celebrates armed brotherhood. It treats military instinct as more honest than institutional caution. And it presents American men as the moral center inside a foreign disaster. Some viewers will find that powerful. Others will find it too familiar, maybe even dangerous. For me, the film is most effective when it stays inside the panic of that night. When it shows men making impossible decisions under pressure, it feels immediate and human. But when it leans too heavily into the image of heroic Americans against a faceless hostile world, it starts to feel smaller than the real tragedy it is trying to portray. Because Benghazi was not just an action setting, it was a real place, full of real people, living through the aftermath of political collapse, violence, and fear. The film knows that on some level, but it does not give that side enough space. And that is the tension. 13 Hours wants to be a tribute. Often, it succeeds. But it also becomes a very American memory of a much larger disaster. A memory where one group is deeply humanized and almost everyone else is kept at a distance. That makes the movie gripping, yes. Emotional, absolutely. But also limited. Here's something I can't ignore about 13 Hours, and it's one of the things that makes the film feel both powerful and frustrating at the same time. The movie is laser-focused on the Americans. You follow Silva, Woods, and the rest of the GRS team. You see their fear, their courage, their exhaustion, their frustration with delayed help. You even get their family lives peppered in so that every bullet fired has weight. You care about these men. The film makes sure of that. But what about the other side? The Libyan civilians, the militants, their families, their lives. Almost completely absent. For a story set in the middle of a city under attack, the film treats the Libyans mostly as background noise. They are the danger, the threat, the wave of armed bodies rushing in. You don't get to see much of their humanity, their fear, or their grief until the very end, when there's a brief, almost poetic glance at their family's mourning. And that moment, brief as it is, hits hard. Because you suddenly realize how one-sided the lens has been. The Americans are named, framed, given heroism, fear, backstory, emotion. The Libyans, they are almost entirely reduced to threat or atmosphere. Their city is in chaos, yes, but we never get the same intimate sense of loss or personal stakes. It's not like the film is trying to insult anyone. It's telling the story it chose to tell. But that choice creates a moral imbalance. You walk away feeling the heroism of the contractors, but the suffering around them, while visible, is largely anonymous. The people dying, fleeing, or trapped by the violence rarely feel like individuals. Their grief is seen from the outside, and we are never asked to sit in it the way we sit with the Americans. That imbalance doesn't ruin the movie. It's still tense, emotional, and intense. But it does leave a lingering sense that we're only getting part of the story. The bravery of the team is undeniable. The chaos of the night is palpable. The fear and frustration are real. Yet by framing the narrative almost entirely through American eyes, the film also reminds you that war is messy, and perspective is everything. The lives we care about on screen are carefully chosen. The others, the thousands of Libyans living in that chaos, exist mostly in shadows and smoke. That's why, as exciting and gripping as 13 Hours is, there's also a quiet unease. It's heroic, it's thrilling, it's terrifying, but it's morally narrow. It shows us the human cost, yes, but almost entirely from one side, and once you notice that, it's impossible to forget. The way 13 Hours handles the enemy is one of the more uncomfortable parts of the film, because for most of the runtime, the attackers are not really characters. They are shapes in the dark, headlights coming down the road. Men with rifles on rooftops, figures moving behind smoke, muzzle flashes, shouting, bodies dropping, another truck pulling up, another wave coming in, and from the point of view of the GRS team, that makes sense. In the middle of a night like that, nobody has time to ask for backstory. You are not sitting there calmly figuring out who believes what, who belongs to which faction, or why each person picked up a weapon. You are trying to survive. You are trying to tell whether the next person coming toward the gate is friendly or about to kill you. So on a tactical level, the movie's approach works. The enemy feels unknown, unpredictable, and almost faceless because that is how the threat would feel to the men under attack. That uncertainty is part of the fear. You do not know where the next shot is coming from. You do not know who is watching from the street. You do not know if the person standing near you is an ally, a bystander, or someone waiting for the right second to turn. But as a movie, that choice has a cost, because when the enemy is mostly just a mass of armed bodies, the world becomes very simple. The Americans are named, they have families, they have jokes, they have emotional beats. They have fear, loyalty, regret, and sacrifice. The attackers, meanwhile, are mostly targets. That creates distance. You feel the danger, but you do not really understand the people creating it. And maybe the film is not trying to make us understand them. Maybe it only wants to show what that night felt like from one side. Fair enough. But still, when a movie is dealing with real violence in a real country, that lack of human texture starts to stand out. The Libyan side is not completely ignored, though. There are small moments where the film hints that this place is not just full of enemies. Some Libyans help, some are scared, some are caught in the middle. And near the end, when families come to mourn the dead, the movie briefly opens a door it probably should have opened earlier. That moment is quiet, but it matters, because suddenly the bodies are not just bodies, they belong to someone. They had mothers, brothers, families, people who will cry over them in the morning. And for a second, the movie steps outside the usual action film framing and reminds you that grief does not only exist inside the American compound. I actually wish there was more of that, not because the film needs to excuse the attackers or soften the horror of what happened. It does not. The attack is brutal. The danger is real. The contractors are fighting for their lives. But showing humanity on the other side does not weaken the story. It makes the tragedy feel bigger, messier, and more honest. Instead, 13 Hours mostly keeps the enemy at a distance. That helps the siege tension, because the threat feels endless and unknowable, but it also makes the film feel morally narrow. The Libyan characters are either threats, possible threats, background figures, or brief symbols of grief. Very few are allowed to become people in the way the American characters are allowed to become people, and that is the tension here. As an action thriller, faceless enemies make the night scarier. As a real-world war story, faceless enemies make the world smaller. So the film works best when it remembers the chaos included more than just American fear. Those brief glimpses of Libyan humanity give the movie a little more weight. They suggest a wider tragedy beyond the gunfire and the compound walls, but they are only glimpses. And once you notice that, it becomes hard not to wonder what kind of film 13 Hours might have been if it had looked just a little longer at the people living on the other side of the smoke. Let's get to the part most people are here for: the action. And I'll be honest, 13 Hours delivers, not in a clean, Hollywood-perfect way where everything is choreographed like a dance. No, this feels messy. It feels chaotic. It feels like a real battle. That is one of the movie's strongest points. Once the attack begins, you are right there with the team. Roofs, gates, streets, smoke, fire, tracer fire streaking past. Bay throws you into it. You're not watching a polished set piece. You're watching men reacting to things happening too fast, too unpredictably, with limited information. And that makes it tense in a way a lot of action movies fail to achieve. The siege itself feels relentless. It's not a single battle and done. It's wave after wave. You see the exhaustion, the frustration, the split-second decisions. The men have to figure out where the threat is, who is covered, who needs support. Every movement counts. Every second matters. What makes it work even more is how grounded it feels. The team uses cover. They communicate under fire. They react to each other. You see small tactical details, moving across rooftops, calling out positions, checking angles. It's not perfect realism, but it's believable enough that you buy the tension. And yet Bay does not completely give up his cinematic style. Explosions, fire, and pyrotechnics are everywhere, but they don't feel like the main point. They enhance the chaos rather than define it. This is less Transformers-style CGI madness, and more you are in the middle of hell. The combat also hits you physically. The noise, the shouting, the staccato editing, your pulse starts racing. You feel the pressure the men are under. And at the same time, you get a sense of the weight of the night, the long, exhausting hours where survival is all that matters. One interesting thing is how the film blends realism with cinematic tension. It's grounded, but it's still a movie. Sometimes it jumps a bit between vantage points, a roof here, a street there, a flare lighting the compound. You occasionally need to catch your bearings. That mirrors the fog of war. You don't always know what is happening even when you are watching it. And that's the point. The action isn't just adrenaline for the sake of spectacle. It communicates fear, confusion, and the sheer intensity of being under siege. That said, the action does get repetitive. Wave after wave, shoot, reload, regroup, fire again. It can wear on you after a while, but the repetition also reinforces the relentless nature of what the team faced. It's exhausting for the characters, and in a way, it's exhausting for the audience too. Overall, the combat and siege sequences are the backbone of 13 Hours. They are visceral, tense, and compelling. They make you feel like you're there in the firefight, that every decision matters, and that chaos can strike at any moment. If you came for a Michael Bay war movie with real stakes, this is where the film really earns its keep. Something that really stood out to me about 13 Hours is how often it feels less like a traditional war movie and more like a horror film. I mean that in the best way. From the moment the attack begins, you're on edge. You don't know where the next threat is coming from. You don't know who's hiding behind a wall, who's crouched in a corner, or which roof will suddenly erupt in gunfire. Every shadow feels alive. Every movement feels dangerous. The city itself feels like it's closing in. Bay and the cinematographer do a brilliant job of creating that claustrophobic, oppressive tension. Handheld shots, smoke, darkness, the crack of gunfire. It all combines to make you feel like you're trapped in the same space as the contractors. You can almost sense the fear of the men as they move through the chaos, uncertain who's friend or foe, and it's relentless. There are moments when the action pauses just enough for you to take a breath, only for another wave of violence to slam into the scene. It mirrors the feeling of being trapped in horror. You never feel safe, and the next attack could come from anywhere. What makes it even more effective is how the movie layers survival instincts on top of the terror. These aren't just soldiers running and firing. They are thinking, calculating, trying to keep themselves and the people they're protecting alive. Every decision carries weight. Move the wrong way, make the wrong call, hesitate for too long, and someone could die. That uncertainty keeps your pulse racing. And like a good horror movie, there's a sense of isolation. Help feels far away, distant, or entirely absent. Communications are delayed. Commands are unclear. The men are essentially on their own in a hostile environment. That adds a real sense of helplessness to the tension. Even quieter moments contribute to the horror-like atmosphere. A hallway, a compound wall, a street in darkness, small sounds, fleeting shadows, and unseen threats all make the audience hold their breath. The fear is not just physical, it's psychological. By blending the intensity of combat with this survival horror vibe, 13 Hours manages to create an emotional experience that goes beyond just explosions and gunfire. You feel the dread, you feel the uncertainty, you feel the pressure crushing down on the men. In short, this is not just a war movie. It's a siege thriller where the terror and suspense almost rival a traditional horror film, and that makes the night in Benghazi feel terrifyingly real. Now, as intense as 13 Hours can be, this is also where the movie starts testing your patience, because this is a long film, and not just long because the story needs room to breathe, long. At times, it feels like there is a tighter, sharper version of this movie hiding somewhere underneath the runtime. The first stretch takes its time setting up Benghazi, the CIA annex, the contractors, the compound, and the tension around the city. Some of that works. Actually, a lot of it is necessary. You need to understand the environment before everything falls apart. You need to feel the danger sitting in the background, but the buildup also drags in places. The movie spends a lot of time with the team before the attack, yet somehow, not all of that time turns into deeper character development. You get the mood, you get the danger, you get the sense that something bad is coming. But you do not always get enough personal detail to justify how long the setup lasts. Then the attack begins, and for a while the pacing tightens immediately. The movie wakes up. Suddenly, there is urgency. The compound is under attack. The team has to move. Communication is messy. Nobody knows exactly what is happening. That section is gripping because everything feels unstable and immediate. But after that, another issue appears: repetition. The siege goes on, and yes, that is part of the point. The real ordeal lasted for hours. The title itself tells you this is going to be a long night. The movie wants you to feel the exhaustion, the waiting, the repeated waves of violence. Still, as a viewing experience, it can start to feel like the same sequence being reshuffled. A threat appears in the distance. The team watches. Someone calls it out. Gunfire erupts. There is shouting, smoke, explosions, regrouping, then another incoming threat, again and again. At first, it is tense. Then it becomes familiar. And eventually, depending on your patience, it can start to feel a little numbing. That is the tricky thing with this movie. The repetition may be emotionally accurate to the situation, but cinematically, it weakens the impact after a while. When every attack is played at maximum intensity, the movie has fewer places to go. The volume is already turned up, the danger is already high, so the later scenes have to work harder to feel different from the earlier ones. Sometimes they do, sometimes they do not. There are also moments where the film almost feels like a video game. Move to this position, defend this gate, watch that road, take out that target, survive the next wave. The combat is well staged, but the structure can become mechanical. You are still engaged, but not always emotionally pulled in. And honestly, this is where a stronger edit could have helped a lot. Cutting 20 or even 30 minutes would not have destroyed the story. It might have made it more powerful. A tighter version could have preserved the tension while reducing the fatigue. Because when a movie about exhaustion starts exhausting the audience in the wrong way, that becomes a problem. The constant timestamps and location markers also add to that feeling. They are supposed to keep us oriented, and sometimes they do. But after a while, you start noticing them more than you should. The movie keeps reminding us of the time, the place, the next tactical position, but it does not always turn that information into stronger drama. And that is the issue. The film has urgency, but not always momentum. Those are different things. Urgency means the characters are in danger. Momentum means the story keeps evolving in a way that pulls you forward. 13 Hours has plenty of danger, but parts of the middle stretch begin to circle the same emotional beat. They are trapped, help is not coming fast enough, another attack is coming, they have to hold the line. That is powerful the first few times. After a while, it needs more variation. To be fair, the overlength does not ruin the movie. The strongest sequences still hit hard. The final stretch still carries emotion. The action is still intense enough to keep most viewers watching, but the pacing issues keep 13 hours from being as sharp as it could have been. There is a very strong siege thriller here. You can feel it. The tension, the real event weight, the performances, the combat staging, all of that is there. It just needed less repetition, a cleaner rhythm, and the confidence to leave a few explosions on the cutting room floor. Now, talking about 13 hours without talking about Michael Bay is basically impossible, because his name changes the way you walk into the movie. You hear Michael Bay war film, and immediately you expect a certain kind of experience. Big explosions, loud editing, hero shots, helicopters, men walking through smoke like they're on the cover of a military recruitment poster. And to be fair, 13 hours does have plenty of that. But what surprised me is that Bay actually pulls himself back here. Not completely. Let's not get carried away. This is still a Michael Bay movie. You still get the dramatic camera angles, the heavy machinery, the glowing fire, the slow-motion touches, the hard-edged military imagery. There are moments where you can almost feel him resisting the urge to turn everything into pure spectacle, and sometimes he loses that fight. But compared to his more chaotic work, especially the louder blockbuster stuff, 13 hours feels more focused. More grounded, more serious. It has a kind of discipline you do not always associate with him, and honestly, that helps the movie a lot. The story is already intense. It does not need robots falling through buildings or impossible action physics. It needs pressure. It needs fear. It needs confusion. It needs that feeling of men trapped in a place where the situation is getting worse by the minute. And when Bay leans into that, when he lets the danger build without turning every second into visual fireworks, the film works. You can tell he is trying to treat the subject with respect. He knows this is based on real events. He knows real people died. He knows this is not just another action playground. So the direction has more weight than usual. The explosions are still there, obviously, but they do not always feel like the whole point. Sometimes they feel like part of the nightmare. That is the best version of Bay in this movie. When the firefights begin, he gives the action scale and force. The streets feel dangerous. The compound feels exposed. The rooftops feel like the last thin line between survival and collapse. He understands how to make a siege feel physically overwhelming. And for once, his love of intensity actually matches the material. But then the old habits creep in. There are still those overly polished hero moments. The tough guys framed in firelight. The dramatic walk shots. The emotional beats pushed just a little harder than they need to be. The dialogue already has enough macho energy, and Bay's direction sometimes adds another layer on top of it. It is like the movie wants to be gritty and grounded, but every now and then, Bay remembers he is Michael Bay and cannot help himself. The editing can also get rough. There are moments where the handheld camera and quick cutting add to the chaos in a good way. You feel the panic, you feel the disorientation. But there are other moments where it becomes too much, where the scene loses clarity and starts to feel busy instead of tense. That is the constant push and pull here. Bay's style gives the movie energy. Bay's style also holds it back. When he restrains himself, 13 Hours becomes one of his strongest films. You see the director he can be when he has real stakes, a serious tone, and a story that benefits from pressure instead of excess. There is genuine craft in the way he stages the action. There is momentum. There is impact. There are moments where he makes the night feel terrifying. But when he overplays the emotion or reaches for familiar visual tricks, the film becomes less honest. Not terrible, just less sharp. You start noticing the filmmaking instead of feeling the situation. Still, I would rather have this version of Bay than the completely unfiltered one, because 13 Hours proves something interesting. Michael Bay can make a more grounded, more mature film when he chooses to. He may not fully abandon his instincts, and maybe he never will, but here those instincts are at least pointed towards something with real human stakes. So yes, this is restrained by Bay standards, but by Bay standards is doing a lot of work. It is still loud, still muscular, still obsessed with fire, metal, sweat, and heroic framing. But beneath all that, there is a serious attempt to tell a painful story with force and respect. And even when the movie stumbles, that effort is visible. Visually, 13 Hours is easily one of the stronger parts of the film. Whatever problems the movie has with pacing or character depth, it does know how to put you inside a dangerous space. Benghazi does not feel clean or staged. It feels dusty, tense, broken down, and constantly on edge. The streets have that war-torn heaviness to them, like every corner has seen trouble before the camera even arrived, and the cinematography does a lot of work here. The movie uses wide shots and aerial views to show how exposed everything is. You see the city from above, the roads, the compounds, the distance between places, and suddenly the situation feels bigger and more isolated at the same time. The men are not just fighting inside one building. They are surrounded by a whole environment that could turn against them at any moment. Those aerial shots are some of the most effective images in the film. They give the story scale. They remind you how small this team really is compared to the chaos around them. You see lights in the distance, roads stretching out, vehicles moving through the dark, and there is this uncomfortable feeling that danger is not coming from one direction. It could come from anywhere. Then, when the camera drops back down to ground level, the movie becomes much more claustrophobic. The handheld camera work, the tight movements, the quick reactions, it all adds to that sense of disorder. Sometimes it works beautifully. You feel the panic. You feel the pressure. You feel like the camera is trying to keep up with men who are making decisions faster than anyone can explain them. Now, does the shaky cam go too far sometimes? Yeah, absolutely. There are moments where the chaos feels immersive, and then there are moments where it starts to get a little messy. You are trying to figure out who is where, who is firing, what direction the threat is coming from, and the camera is not always helping. But in the stronger sequences, that roughness actually fits. It makes the battle feel unstable instead of polished. The color style is also very Bay. You get that harsh contrast, the smoky night skies, the orange glow of fire, the blue shadows, the metallic military texture. Sometimes it looks incredible. Sometimes it feels a little too stylized, like the movie cannot fully resist turning real-world violence into a glossy action image. But when it works, it really works. The night combat has a brutal visual rhythm. Muzzle flashes cut through darkness. Explosions briefly reveal faces and walls. Smoke rolls across the compound. Headlights creep forward like warnings. There is a constant sense that the frame is hiding something dangerous just outside your view. And then there is the sound. This movie is loud, obviously. It is Michael Bay. But the sound design is not just noise for the sake of noise. The gunfire has impact. The explosions feel heavy. The radio chatter, shouting, distant vehicles, and sudden silences all help create that feeling of being trapped in an active combat zone. The best sound moments are not always the biggest ones either. Sometimes it is the pause before the next attack, the low rumble in the distance, a voice cracking over comms, a sudden burst of gunfire after a moment of uncertainty. That contrast gives the action more tension because you are not just waiting for explosions, you are listening for danger. Lorne Balfe's score also deserves credit. It does not always push itself to the front, and that is a good thing. In a movie that already has this much gunfire and emotional pressure, an overbearing score could have made everything feel manipulative. Instead, the music often sits underneath the action, giving it urgency without completely drowning the scene. And in the more emotional moments, the score helps the film land without turning it into pure melodrama. It adds sadness, exhaustion, and weight, especially near the end when the cost of the night starts to settle in. So technically, 13 Hours is a very polished film. The visuals are gritty but cinematic. The aerial shots add scale. The ground-level camera work adds panic. The sound design makes the combat feel physically intense. And the music supports the emotion without always shouting over it. It is not flawless. The shaky cam can be too much. The color grading sometimes feels overly stylized. And a few visual choices are more Michael Bay action poster than grounded war drama. But when the film is firing on all cylinders, the technical craft is hard to deny. You feel the heat, the smoke, the distance, the noise, the exhaustion. You feel the city closing in. And even when the script stumbles, the filmmaking keeps the pressure alive. What gives 13 Hours its real punch is the fact that, beneath all the explosions and military chaos, this is built around something that actually happened, and you feel that. Even when the movie gets too loud, even when it leans into Michael Bay's usual style, even when the dialogue gets a little stiff, there is still this uncomfortable weight underneath everything. These are not just fictional men pinned down in a made-up action scenario. This was a real night. Real people were trapped. Real people were waiting for help. Real people did not come home. That changes the way the movie plays. A normal action film can throw bodies around, blow up vehicles, and move on to the next set piece. 13 Hours cannot completely do that because the story is tied to actual loss. The violence has a different texture. You may question certain details. You may wonder how accurate every moment is, but the emotional foundation is hard to ignore. The film really leans into that sense of dread. You see these men trying to stay calm, trying to work the problem, trying to protect people while also knowing their own families are far away. And that family element, even when the movie pushes it a little too directly, does add something. It reminds you that these contractors are not just soldiers in a firefight. They are fathers, husbands, friends, people with entire lives sitting outside the frame. That is where John Krasinski's performance helps a lot. With Jack Silva, you can feel the conflict of a man who knows this job, understands the danger, and still carries the emotional cost of being away from home. The film does not always handle that with subtlety, but Krasinski makes it feel sincere. He gives the character this quiet sadness, like every mission takes something from him even before the bullets start flying. And as the night gets worse, that emotional pressure builds. The movie becomes less about victory and more about endurance, surviving until morning, holding the line, waiting for support, trying to save whoever can still be saved. There is something deeply painful about watching men do everything right in the moment and still feel powerless against the larger failure around them. That is what makes the real event angle so effective. The film is not just asking, will they make it? It is also asking, how did it get this bad? And it never gives a fully satisfying answer. Maybe that is frustrating, maybe it is appropriate. Because part of the tragedy of Benghazi, at least as the movie presents it, is that the people on the ground are living through consequences they cannot control. They are caught inside a situation shaped by decisions made far away, and all they can do is fight through the immediate nightmare. The ending is where the emotional weight really lands, not in a perfect way. The movie still has its heavy-handed moments, but by that point the exhaustion has built up, the fear has built up, the losses have built up. You feel the cost of the night settling over everyone who survived it. And because this is based on true events, that sadness does not disappear when the scene ends. You are left thinking about the men who died, the families who received the worst possible news, and the people who had to carry that night with them afterward. You are also left thinking about the unanswered questions, the delays, the confusion, and the terrible gap between what should have happened and what did happen. That is why 13 Hours works emotionally, even when it does not always work dramatically. The characters could have been deeper, the script could have been sharper, the politics could have been more complex, but the real tragedy underneath the film gives it a force that is hard to dismiss. You are not just watching a siege. You are watching a dramatized memory of a night that left scars. And that is what stays with you after the gunfire stops. If you're a fan of war movies, you're probably going to compare 13 Hours to others in the genre, and that's a natural thing to do. Off the top, it immediately calls to mind films like Black Hawk Down, American Sniper, Lone Survivor, even Zero Dark 30 or The Hurt Locker. These are movies that balance action with character, tension with strategy, and show both the physical and emotional cost of combat. In some ways, 13 Hours sits somewhere in the middle of that spectrum. It is more grounded than the average Michael Bay blockbuster, but it is not quite as nuanced or psychologically layered as a Hurt Locker or a Zero Dark 30. You feel the chaos and danger, but you don't always get the internal struggles of each soldier the way those films let you in on them. The action sequences are the highlight, which is similar to Black Hawk Down. The siege, the urban combat, the sense of being outnumbered, Bay captures that intensity well. You can almost feel the heat, the smoke, and the confusion. But unlike Black Hawk Down, the characters outside of Silver and Roan don't feel fully individual. You respect their bravery, but you don't know them deeply. Compared to American Sniper or Lone Survivor, the film shares the heroism factor. It honors the men on the ground. You see courage under impossible circumstances. You feel the pressure, the fear, the camaraderie. But the emotional beats are sometimes more surface level than those films, which dig into the psychological trauma and moral ambiguity of war. And in terms of realism, 13 Hours is interesting. It has the chaos and tactical detail of these other films. The firefights feel messy and overwhelming, just as they would in real life. But it also carries Bay's signature visual flair, explosions, dramatic shots, stylized orange and teal lighting, that sets it apart from the grittier, almost documentary feel of some of the other modern war films. So if you love war movies, 13 Hours feels familiar but also distinctly Bay. It gives you the thrills, the tension, the siege drama, and the camaraderie, but it's lighter on psychological exploration and moral ambiguity than the deepest entries in the genre. I'd say it sits nicely for someone who wants a mix, grounded enough to feel real, but cinematic enough to satisfy the spectacle. Not quite a classic, not quite a documentary-style war film, but a unique middle ground that gives you plenty of pulse-bounding moments. It's like a bridge between pure adrenaline and the more contemplative war stories. Just don't expect it to fully replace those other films. But it does enough to stand on its own and deliver a night in Benghazi that you won't easily forget. One of the tricky things about 13 Hours is that you can never fully separate the movie from the real event behind it. The film is based on Mitchell Zuckoff's book, and it presents itself as a ground-level version of what happened during the Benghazi attack. Not the full political storm afterward, not the hearings, not every argument about who knew what, who gave which order, or why help did not arrive faster. It narrows the lens and says, basically, let's stay with the men who were there. And as a movie choice, that makes sense. The story becomes more immediate that way. You are not sitting in conference rooms watching officials debate policy. You are with the contractors, inside the confusion, trying to understand the danger as they understand it. The film wants you to feel the chaos first, not analyze it from a distance. But that also creates a problem, because Benghazi is not just a survival story. It is an event surrounded by unanswered questions, contradictions, political arguments, and competing versions of what happened. So when the movie focuses almost entirely on the battlefield experience, it becomes powerful emotionally, but incomplete historically. And that incompleteness is hard to ignore. The film shows delay, it shows frustration, it shows the men on the ground desperate to act while assistance feels slow, unclear, or absent. It gives us the emotional truth of abandonment, or at least the feeling of abandonment. But does it give us the whole truth of the event? That is where things get murky. Some viewers may accept the movie as a faithful account of the contractors' experience. Others may question what was changed, simplified, left out, or shaped for dramatic effect. And honestly, unless you already know the full timeline from outside sources, the movie itself does not give you enough to settle those debates. It does not really want to. 13 Hours is not built like an investigation. It is not trying to be the final report on Benghazi. It is not carefully weighing every claim or walking through every disputed detail. It is built like a siege film, intense, emotional, focused, and limited to the perspective of men under fire. That limited perspective is both honest and frustrating. Honest, because in the middle of the attack, nobody had perfect information. The confusion is part of the point. The men did not know everything. They were not watching the whole situation from above. They were reacting to smoke, gunfire, radio calls, missing people, and the terrible feeling that time was slipping away. Frustrating because after the movie ends, you may still be asking the same questions you had before it began. Who failed? How much could have been prevented? What really happened behind closed doors? Which delays were avoidable? Which decisions were misunderstood? And how much of what we are watching is precise history versus dramatic reconstruction? The movie does not fully answer those questions, and maybe that is why it feels so unresolved. There is no clean final explanation, no neat courtroom-style conclusion, no moment where the film pauses and says, "Here is exactly what happened." Instead, it leaves you with a bruised, chaotic memory of one night and the sense that the larger truth is still sitting somewhere outside the frame. That can be disappointing if you came looking for clarity. But as a dramatic experience, it does capture something real about events like this. Sometimes the people living through history do not have the luxury of understanding it while it is happening. They only know the fear, the noise, the orders that do or do not come, and the people beside them trying to survive. So when it comes to historical accuracy, 13 Hours sits in a strange place. It feels sincere. It feels urgent. It feels rooted in real testimony and real loss. But it also feels selective, shaped, and incomplete. It gives us one version of the night, not the whole picture, and that is probably the fairest way to view it. Not as the final truth of Benghazi, not as a full political explanation, but as a dramatized account of men trapped inside the chaos, powerful, emotional, and worth watching, while still leaving the biggest questions unanswered. So where does 13 Hours, the Secret Soldiers of Benghazi, finally land? Honestly, somewhere in the middle of respect and frustration. It is not a perfect war film, not even close. It is too long, too repetitive in places, and sometimes too narrow in the way it sees the world around the American characters. The dialogue can be rough, the character work is uneven. And even though the film is based on a real event, it never fully answers the bigger questions hanging over Benghazi. But at the same time, I cannot dismiss it, because when 13 Hours works, it really works. The tension is strong. The action has weight. The siege sequences are intense, messy, and exhausting in a way that feels appropriate for the story being told. Michael Bay, for all his usual habits, actually shows more restraint here than expected. He still gives us explosions, fire, dramatic framing, and all the familiar Bay machinery, but there is also a seriousness to this movie that keeps it from feeling like empty spectacle, and the cast helps a lot. John Krasinski gives the film a grounded emotional center. James Badgedale brings quiet authority. The rest of the team feels believable, even when the script does not always make them distinct enough. You buy them as men who know how to move under pressure, men who trust each other, men who understand danger before everyone else is willing to admit it. That is the part of the film that stays with you, not the politics, really. Not the full historical explanation, because the movie does not give you one. What stays is the feeling of being trapped in that night, the waiting, the confusion, the frustration when help feels too slow or too far away. The sense that these men are holding a line while the whole situation keeps slipping further out of control. As a tribute to the contractors, the film is sincere. As a historical account, it is incomplete. As a piece of action filmmaking, it is strong. As a character drama, it is uneven. and that is the honest balance. I do think 13 Hours is one of Michael Bay's better efforts. It has more heart than a lot of his bigger, louder movies, and it proves that when he pulls back just a little, his style can actually serve a story instead of swallowing it whole. The action scenes are not just noise. They create fear, pressure, and momentum, but the film also reminds you of his limitations. He pushes emotion too hard. He lets the runtime stretch. He turns some of the violence into spectacle when the tragedy probably needed a little more quiet. And he never fully escapes that familiar American war movie lens where one side is deeply humanized and the other is mostly kept in shadow. Still, by the end, the movie has power. Maybe not depth in the way a great war film has depth, maybe not complexity in the way this real event deserved, but power, yes. You feel the exhaustion, you feel the anger, you feel the loss. You feel the courage of men trying to survive an impossible situation while protecting whoever they can. So my final take is this: 13 Hours is flawed, overlong, sometimes heavy-handed and politically limited, but it is also gripping, emotional, and technically impressive. It does not explain Benghazi. It does not settle the debate. It does not become the great, definitive film about that night. But as a raw siege thriller about fear, loyalty, confusion, and survival, it hits harder than expected. And even with all its problems, it is difficult to walk away from it feeling nothing.